For those of you I don't know, my name's Michael Lestrange and I'm the head of the National Security College, and I'd like to warmly welcome all of you here this evening to this important event in our public seminar series. At the outset, can I acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. This evening is a very important occasion for the National Security College in having the presence of Professor Stephen Walt, the Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. At the outset, can I say that we here at the NSC are very appreciative of the support of the United States Studies Centre in enabling Professor Walt's presence this evening. The US Studies Centre in Sydney is hosting Professor Walt on his Australian visit, and we've been fortunate enough to leverage him down to Canberra for 24 hours, which was an opportunity I thought the ANU and the wider community shouldn't miss. So it's a great honour and pleasure to have Stephen here this evening, and to have had him for a working lunch today with some senior officials and some academic staff. As all of you will know, Professor Stephen Walt, through his teachings and his writings and his other scholarly engagements, has made a fundamentally significant and influential contribution to the study of international relations. And he's done that both at a conceptual level, enhancing our understanding of some of the big issues that underpin this discipline, and also in terms of how power politics actually works. That's been an important contribution over a long period, and added to that, he's also been involved extensively in the public policy debate, bringing, as it inevitably does, bouquets and brickbats. But tonight, having Stephen Walt here at the ANU, with the contribution that he's made and with the involvement that he has, and with the perspective that he provides, is a huge honour for all of us here, and I'm very grateful to him for coming to Canberra from Sydney, en route to Perth, and then back to the United States. So this is an important occasion for us, and it's an important occasion, I think, for the wider community to have exposure to the thinking that underpins Professor Walt's thinking. Tonight he's going to speak on the rise of China and America's Asian allies, which is not only topical in terms of current events, but it's the single most important issue in terms of our country's public policy, and I suspect in terms of the region and the wider world, how America and China engage and hopefully cooperate in the future. So it's a great pleasure this evening to invite Professor Walt to address us. He'll speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then there'll be opportunity for question and answer period thereafter. So would you join with me in welcoming Professor Stephen Walt?
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here in Canberra, and I want to thank Michael and the National Security College and also the US Studies Centre in Sydney for making my visit to Australia possible. I'm going to focus today on the strategic implications of China's increasing power, and in particular on how it will affect US policy in Asia and then alliance relations throughout the region. Now, as you all know, there is a lively debate going on about the strategic implications of China's rise. Optimists tend to think that a serious rivalry between China and the United States is not inevitable, and that careful diplomacy combined with growing economic interdependence can lead to a constructive partnership and keep trouble away. Those of us who are more pessimistic, I would be inclined to say more realistic, think that a serious rivalry is going to be very hard to avoid, though we don't necessarily believe war is inevitable or anything like that. Now, how these events unfold in the future will depend first on how China behaves as it grows more powerful, how the United States responds to that, and then how other states in Asia react. And those are the three issues that I'm going to focus on in my remarks. I'm going to argue that if China continues to grow economically at more or less, let's say, an impressive rate, then the United States and China are virtually certain to be serious rivals. Security competition between them is likely to be intense, and extensive cooperation will be hard to sustain. Now, again, I'm not saying war is inevitable or that trade and other forms of cooperation will stop, but the danger of war will go up. It would be nice if that were not the case, but statecraft needs to begin not with wishful thinking, but with a clear-eyed sense of what the possibilities are. Now, I believe that situation is going to encourage states in Asia to seek closer ties with the United States and encourage the United States to devote more of its strategic attention to Asian affairs. In other words, the rebalance is not a temporary gesture. It's likely to continue and intensify. But maintaining an effective balancing coalition is not going to be easy, and it's going to require quite adroit alliance management and intelligent diplomacy by Washington and by our various friends in Asia. Now, to explain why I think all that, I'm going to first say a little bit about what I think theory and history tell us about this question. Then I'm going to talk about how Asian countries are likely to react and identify some of the dilemmas of alliance management we're going to face. I'll consider some of the obvious counter-arguments you might raise, and then I'll outline some policy implications at the very end. First point I would make is that looking at the current state of Sino-American relations doesn't tell you very much about the future. And the reason is because how states define their interests and how they try to defend them is largely determined by their relative power. As states grow stronger, their vital interests tend to expand. All you have to do is look at the history of the United States, which begins as 13 weak and vulnerable colonies clinging to the eastern seaboard in the United States with hardly any vital interests except survival, and gradually expanding across North America, and by the year 2000, deciding that our vital interests really exist in almost every corner of the world. This means that the present state of Sino-American relations doesn't tell you that much because it's going to change if, and it's not a certainty, but if China continues to become more powerful. For one thing, history suggests that the two most powerful states in the international system rarely get along very well. Whether one wants to think of Athens and Sparta, Rome and Carthage, England and France, the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War, the reason is simple. They don't get along because each is the other's greatest potential threat. Neither can be completely sure what the other might do today or in the future, and therefore they tend to cast a rather wary eye upon each other. And they become very sensitive to the balance of power between them. Who's rising, who's falling, who's ahead, what specific vulnerabilities each might have. The implication here is if the United States and China are the two strongest states in the system, they're going to compete. They're going to compete for power, they're going to compete for influence. Each will look for ways to get ahead or ways to drag the other back. They'll compete for allies, for advantage, for new military breakthroughs. If one of them gets in serious trouble, the other is not going to come to their aid. And this is going to happen, of course, not because either side's leaders are especially evil or aggressive, but simply because they're trying to preserve their own security and they don't want to be vulnerable if the other side turns out to be particularly aggressive. And remember, you can't just look at the state of Sino-American relations today. You have to ask what current trends look like and what is likely to happen in 10, 20, or 30 years. Again, assuming China continues to rise. Now, assuming China does develop economically and continues this into the future, it's eventually going to have a gross national product larger than the United States. Forecasts of exactly when that's going to occur vary somewhat. As its per capita income rises, its government is going to have more revenue that it can use for various national tasks, including defense. Not surprisingly, China's defense spending has been rising at a quite rapid rate, about 10% a year for quite some time, though it is still substantially smaller in absolute terms than the United States. China's dependence on the outside world is going to continue to grow as well. both in terms of outlets for its goods, but also its demand for natural resources of various kinds, something I don't need to tell people in Australia. And this means, over time, China will want a greater capacity to shape events or influence events in many parts of the world, because it will be economically dependent on things happening there. So the next question is, how is this going to affect China's overall strategy? And then how will the United States respond? Well, for one thing, China has a long history of foreign interference. Its leaders understand that being weak can leave you vulnerable to all sorts of pressure from outside. China's leaders tend to see the world in terms of power politics for that reason. Second, China has a clear interest in establishing a position of hegemony in Asia. Now, I am not talking about creating a vast empire or conquering its neighbors, but rather a position akin to the American position in the Western Hemisphere, where other states in the Western Hemisphere are largely deferential to the United States, don't challenge it directly. China would like to be the strongest power in Asia with no significant military rivals nearby, and eventually it would like to have no other great powers present in this part of the world, no great powers with major security commitments in this part of the world, precisely as the United States did when it announced the Monroe Doctrine and gradually pushed the European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. Why? Of course, because China would be more secure if the United States were absent from Asia and the United States did not have either a military presence here or a significant set of alliance relations. Over time, of course, China is likely to want to see the United States bogged down or preoccupied in places like Afghanistan, Yemen, or Sudan, preoccupied by its relationship with Iran, on bad terms with Russia. These are expensive distractions for the United States, and it keeps us busy while China can build power and expand influence here. China is not likely to give us meaningful help on issues like Iran's nuclear program, and of course, as its economy grows and as its military capabilities increase, China is likely to focus on developing capabilities that make it riskier or costly for the United States to operate close to China's territory. It will continue to press territorial claims in the South China Sea and elsewhere, build up its presence eventually in the Indian Ocean, and most importantly, over time, and again, I'm talking about the future here, it will try to build economic and political ties with its various neighbors and gradually try to persuade other states in Asia to distance themselves from the United States, again, in much the same way that we gradually pushed the United Kingdom out of the Western Hemisphere. Finally, and this would be the worst case from an American point of view, China might one day begin developing closer ties with countries in the Western Hemisphere, both because that might be profitable, but also because it would force the United States, for really the first time in a century, to focus a lot of energy and attention closer to home. And of course, the United States could not object to China doing that, given that we have alliance treaties and security ties with many countries in Asia, including, of course, Australia. Now finally, are there any signs that this forecast of the future is already happening? Of course. Since 1989, as I already mentioned, China's defense expenditures have increased at roughly an average of about 10% per year. It is gradually developing greater power projection capabilities. It already has the largest Navy in the Pacific, not as capable as the US Navy, but it's getting stronger over time. It is seeking certain specific military capabilities, so-called area denial capabilities, designed to make American forces vulnerable if they approach the Chinese mainland. And as you all know, in recent years, it has been more assertive in claiming rights in the South China Sea and East China Sea, and has been rather heavy-handed in recent years in dealing with its neighbors, including its dispute with Japan over a seized Chinese fishing trawler, its seizures of Vietnamese fishing vessels, and its various confrontations with the Philippines over various reefs and shoals in the South China Sea. Of course, a few months ago, it also declared an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea as well. So how is the United States going to react to this? Well, President Obama's visit gives you some indication, the United States is not going to take this lying down, because this runs contrary to what has been America's core grand strategy for over a century. America's basic strategy is to be a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere, no great power rivals anywhere near us, and at the same time prevent any other country from establishing regional hegemony in its own neighborhood, in its own area. That's why the United States fought World War I, why we fought World War II, why we waged the Cold War, ultimately to prevent any other country from becoming a regional hegemon. And the main reason is twofold. One, as long as there are no great powers near the United States, we're safe at home and we're actually free to intervene in other parts of the world without worrying very much about leaving our own homeland vulnerable. If, on the other hand, some other country were able to establish hegemony in its neighborhood, be secure at home, it would then be free to interfere in other parts of the world in ways we might not like, including intervening or interfering in the Western Hemisphere. And to prevent that, as an act of national self-interest, the United States would like to prevent China from establishing a dominant position in Asia. This is not an act of strategic philanthropy on the part of the United States. It's part of America's self-interest. So if I'm right, we ought to see the United States taking steps to discourage China from achieving parity in Asia, and you would see the United States resisting any attempt to push us out of our existing security partnerships. In fact, you'd expect to see the United States trying to forge deeper relations or new relations in Asia as part of an effort to balance against China. In short, I think we can already see the first signs of a competition for influence in Asia between the United States and China. We don't know how serious it's going to be. We don't know if China's future trajectory will permit it to wage that competition in an all-out way, but it's certainly something that we need to think about. The bottom line here is that history, theory, and recent events all suggest that Sino-American relations are going to get worse and that the two states are going to be engaged in a serious security competition in Asia. Now the question is, what does this mean for the other states in Asia, and especially for America's Asian allies? And here I have good news and bad news. The good news is that first, China's strategic position is actually not that favorable. It has 14 neighbors on land and 8 at sea. It has serious territorial disputes with a number of them. 4 of China's neighbors have nuclear weapons. Several others, like Japan, could get them very quickly if they needed to. Several of China's neighbors are potential failed states, which could be a real headache for Beijing down the road. Some of China's neighbors are quite formidable countries in their own right. Japan, third largest economy, quite capable defense forces. And, of course, China faces significant internal challenges, including an aging population, endemic corruption, ethnic tensions, and a deep fear of popular discontent. You just have to compare that with the American position. No great powers nearby, no nuclear weapons states in the Western Hemisphere except us, only 2 states on our borders. We have good relations with both of them. Second, and following from that first point, there's lots of potential for a balancing coalition in Asia, which means that if China does seek regional hegemony, it's not going to be easy for it to get it. If China's power grows, if it acquires military capabilities that threaten its neighbors, if it starts to throw its weight around on a variety of issues, others are going to tend to balance against it. The alternative is either to adopt neutrality or to bandwagon by allying with China, but that means accepting a position of permanent subordination and trusting to China's indefinite benevolence. So long as allies are available, I think balancing is what we should expect. And of course, that's precisely what we're seeing happening today. It's been a steady increase in strategic cooperation between the United States and India. We've restored military-to-military ties with Indonesia. backed South Korea strongly in its recent disputes with the North. Last week, President Obama said the Senkaku Islands were covered by the US-Japan Security Treaty. Yesterday, the Philippines agreed to let American military forces use Philippine facilities for the first time in over 20 years. And a number of other states in Asia have begun to either express concerns about China's rise or in a few cases actually begin to do something about it by increasing their own military capabilities. Those trends all suggest that a Chinese effort to establish hegemony in Asia is going to be resisted by the United States and by a number of Asian countries. That's the good news. The bad news is that there are several features of this balancing coalition that are more worrisome and suggest that managing alliance relations in Asia is going to be a very tricky problem. The first is the familiar problem of collective action that affects all alliances. In an alliance, all the countries in it share a common interest, in this case, a common interest in preventing Chinese dominance. But they all have an individual interest in getting the other people in the alliance to do most of the work and spend most of the money. Right? The result is a lot of free riding. Right? China's defense spending is still increasing at 10% a year. Defense spending in the rest of Asia is either flat or increasing at a much lower rate. The temptation, of course, to try and shift the burden onto one's allies leads alliance members to spend a lot of time posturing with each other and bluffing and bargaining. So America's Asian allies sometimes threaten to bandwagon with China if the United States doesn't do more to protect them. You know, if you guys don't deliver more assurances, your credibility will vanish and we may be forced to make painful choices. They don't really mean it, but that's what they say. Similarly, Americans will sometimes say, well, look, if you're not willing to do more to help us all in Asia, we'll just go home to the Western Hemisphere, leave you to your fate. Now, again, neither side really believes what it's saying here, but if you're doing this for bargaining purposes, it can easily get out of hand. It can easily generate lots of resentment. So there's an inherent problem of alliance cohesion here caused by collective action dilemmas. Second, and here I make a contrast with, say, NATO, particularly during the Cold War. The alliance network I'm talking about here in Asia covers an enormous amount of territory. It was about 250 miles from Paris to Bonn in the Cold War. New Delhi and Taiwan are 3,000 miles apart. The distance from Canberra to Taiwan is 4,500 miles. The distance from Tokyo to Singapore is over 3,000 miles too. And most of these states are separated from each other by bodies of water, which has a couple of effects. Here, pressure or even an attack on one member isn't necessarily a direct threat to the others. If there was a crisis between China and Taiwan, for example, what would Australia or India do? Would it feel compelled to respond? And what could it actually do that might affect the outcome there? This situation, these vast geographic distances, makes it easier, if China wishes, to start playing essentially a divide and rule strategy by trying to make it hard for the different members of this loose coalition to come to one another's aid. Third, and again, in sharp contrast to NATO, the security environment in Asia is not well institutionalized. Different states don't necessarily agree on whether stronger institutions should even be built. One can even make a case that they shouldn't be, that we're better off with the sort of familiar hub and spoke relationship of bilateral relations with Washington. But the point is that very few Asian states have commitments to each other. They have mutual security treaties with the United States. And there are also some significant frictions and historical resentments between some key allies, most notably South Korea and Japan, which makes it more difficult to forge an effective balancing coalition. Last but not least, and again, it's another contrast with NATO, the European members of NATO and the United States traded a lot with each other, but they didn't trade at all with the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact. So the security partnerships and the economic relations ran in parallel. As you all know, that's not the case here in Asia. Most of America's allies in Asia have significant economic ties with China, and if China continues to grow economically, those ties are likely to get bigger or at least remain where they are. So there's at least a potential for trade-offs between the security relationship and the economic relationship, and where meeting security obligations could, in some circumstances, have significant economic costs associated with them. Now, in theory, the solution to these problems is strong and adroit alliance leadership, which the United States could provide. Unfortunately, in recent years, the United States has been badly distracted by the global war on terror, the costly occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. To quote Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore a few years ago, the intellectual resources of the United States have been sucked away by problems in the Middle East, making it difficult for the United States to focus on Asia. So while the ingredients for a strong balancing coalition are there, there's no guarantee that it would achieve sufficient cohesion to achieve its core task. And remember, the issue isn't how well those alliances perform right now. The question is how well they'll perform 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. Now, before I say a word or two about how to address that problem, let me just briefly consider 4 counter-arguments to this rather gloomy picture I've been sketching. The first counter-argument is that this is all very old-fashioned geopolitics, and that the nuclear revolution makes a conventional conflict in Asia very unlikely, and this will keep Sino-American relations within bounds. These are 2 countries with nuclear weapons. They would never confront each other militarily. I agree that nuclear weapons will encourage Beijing and Washington to behave carefully around one another. But remember that both the United States and Soviet Union had vast nuclear arsenals during the Cold War, and we still engaged in a very intense rivalry, which included military confrontations and proxy wars of various kinds. We did not fight each other directly, but we certainly came close once or twice, and we certainly fought proxy wars in various places. The second counterargument is that the United States and China are too tightly dependent on one another economically. They have such profound mutual interests in economic cooperation, and that this will dampen any potential for rivalry. It would be nice if this were true, but there are at least some reasons to be skeptical. As most of you undoubtedly know, there were lots of economic ties between England and the United States throughout the 19th century, but Americans saw England as our principal rival in that entire period. Great Britain and Germany were each other's largest trading partner in 1913, and we all know what happened the year after. China's engagement in the world economy, as I mentioned at the outset, increases its interest in many parts of the world for economic reasons, and therefore could produce various political frictions. And therefore, the mere fact that China is fully engaged and trades a lot with other countries, and indeed trades a lot with the United States, does not, it seems to me, eliminate the possibility of significant geopolitical rivalry. By the way, a little variation on this is that the United States will be able to socialize China by bringing it and welcoming it into various international institutions, as indeed the United States has sought to do for the last 20 years. Again, I think there's nothing wrong with doing that, but it won't prevent rivalry. The Soviet Union was involved in many international institutions, and we still had the Cold War. More importantly, if China continues to become more powerful, it will expect those institutions to conform to its interest. It will not simply passively accept a bunch of international rules that were created by the United States and the West at some point in the past. A third counter-argument, you could argue that the United States and China have such powerful common interests in dealing with climate change, in combating terrorism, other things like that, and those shared interests will override whatever competitive concerns they might have. I think there may be something to that, certainly on the question of climate change, which in the worst case scenarios may loom much larger than, say, who gets to control the Scarborough Shoal, which in any case might be underwater soon. But remember, the United States and Soviet Union cooperated on many issues. For example, nuclear non-proliferation, where our interests were aligned. We didn't want other countries getting nuclear weapons, and in other matters of common interest. But that didn't stop us from having what was at root a key rivalry. And then finally, you sometimes hear people say that, look, a Sino-American rivalry would be a disaster for both countries. All it takes, therefore, is far-sighted and mature leadership. These are the people who emphasize the importance of managing Sino-American relations. Let me make it clear, I'm strongly in favor of managing this relationship well, but I'm not optimistic it will work over the long term. And the reason is simple. It has to work not just in 2014 or 2015 or even through 2020. It has to work through 2030, 2040, 2050. Barring some unforeseen developments. So if both sides have mature, smart, enlightened leaders during this entire period, leaders who are far-sighted and judicious and prudent, then they can probably manage this relationship pretty well and manage any disruptions that might occur. But all it takes is for either Beijing or Washington to be led by, at some point, an impulsive, bellicose, xenophobic, not very competent leader, and you could get lots of trouble. So you have to ask yourself, based on what you know about Chinese history and based on what you know about American political history, how likely is it that at some point in the next 30 or 40 years, there will be a less than competent leader in Washington or a less than competent leader in Beijing, or God forbid, a less than competent set of leaders in both places at the same time? I would say based on the past record, the odds are pretty good you might get the wrong type of people at least once, and that you certainly won't want to base your hopes on tranquility on the assumption that there will always be prudent, far-sighted, judicious, wise statecraft. So that means we have to think a little bit about what ought to be done to strengthen these alliances. And let me close by just offering some brief suggestions here. First, the United States should continue shifting its strategic focus to Asia, and I believe it will. Right? Despite some of the waffling of the last year or two, I think there are very powerful economic and strategic forces that are going to bring even more American attention to Asia. That also means the United States needs to get out of Afghanistan, not re-engage in peripheral conflicts, stop interfering in countries with little or no strategic importance, and stop trying to spread democracy into every corner of the world. And if I may say so, our friends in Australia should not be quite as eager to help us in the future. Second, the United States and its Asian allies, and this includes Australia, need to have some very candid discussions about specific security tasks going forward to establish an effective division of labor. American protection, American support is a valuable asset, but Uncle Sam is not going to do all the work while its allies free ride. It's in our interest to preserve a balance of power in Asia for the reasons I've already stated, but it's even more important to countries in Asia. Because remember, the United States, at the end of the day, can always go home to the Western Hemisphere and probably be perfectly fine. It wouldn't be our first preference, but it's an option that we have available. So one does have to ask why exactly Washington is spending more than 4% of GDP on defense, even now, while our Asian allies spend no more than 2%. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that 2% is some magic number, although I gather it was a prominent number in the latest election here. But the point is that a big gap between what the United States is doing and what its Asian partners are doing is a recipe for trouble. Third, and this is for the United States mostly, the United States has to emphasize the sort of upside to its diplomacy, and to put it in colloquial terms, has to be nice. And what I mean by that is most Asian countries mostly just want a quiet life so that they can trade and invest and get richer. That means that whichever superpower, whichever major power is seen as disturbing the peace, is the one that's raising the temperature, causing trouble in this part of the world, is going to be the one that countries distance themselves. So if China is perceived by other Asian countries as the one that's raising issues, causing trouble, trying to change the status quo, throwing its weight around, there will be a natural tendency to gravitate closer to Washington. If, on the other hand, it's Washington that is seen as raising the temperature, provoking confrontations, etc., then our friends in Asia will start to distance themselves from us. So the United States has an interest in being seen as the status quo power in Asia. I believe we are. We would like to preserve the existing status quo, so this should be relatively easy for us, but it's something we should keep in mind. Now, this has been a rather pessimistic talk, but I am going to end on a at least slightly optimistic note. I just want to reemphasize, nothing I have said today suggests that war in Asia is inevitable, or that the security competition I've described will be so intense as to undermine, let alone reverse, the continued economic development of the region. That's a possibility, because bad things do happen in history, but it's not inevitable by any means. On the contrary, though, I think that peace and stability will be more likely if we recognize that that competition is likely to happen, and if we take prudent and timely steps to prepare for it. And more than anything else, it's going to require skillful and subtle diplomacy backed up by adequate military power. We often focus a lot of attention on the material side, on weapon systems and on deployments and ballistic missile accuracies and ranges and things like that. But in this case, I think at least as much, if not more emphasis, will be needed on intelligence, on a subtle understanding of the region, and having some very smart and capable people in the United States and in our various Asian partners who understand each other pretty well and spend a lot of time working the diplomatic side as much as the purely security side. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that, what I think can best be described as magisterial survey of the issues that we're trying to grapple with and many other countries are grappling with in relation to the future of China. We have an opportunity for some questions and answers. It's a big audience. I know people will want to raise issues, question Stephen on some of what he said, and maybe raise issues about what he hasn't said. Can I just ask you to basically declare your name and where you're from, and then keep the question as focused as possible, and of course always keeping it a question rather than a statement. So we have 2 microphones, and I'd invite the first contributions.
Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. I just have one very straightforward and simple question. My name is Peter Howarth, by the way. I'm from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Policy Planning. From Washington's perspective, what is Australia's value as an ally to the US?
I'm sorry you're of no value whatsoever. Never mind. Yeah. No, I should make it clear, by the way, if it wasn't already obvious, that I am not speaking on behalf of the US government. I am not connected to the administration in any particular way, and so these are just my views. I don't even speak for Harvard University. Now, to answer the question, I think there are several ways in which Australia is considered a valuable ally. We all know the sort of cliches about how Australia has fought with the United States in every war we've ever fought. And as I hinted near the end there, once or twice, I think it might have been better if you had told us we were about to do something stupid rather than telling us that you were with us, most notably in Iraq. But I think that there is something in the rather long and intensive set of security ties that have developed between the two countries really since 1945, sort of beginning in World War II. So Australia is, I think, should be thought of as first a strategic location, right? If the United States wants to be engaged in Asia, having a close relationship with Australia provides us access to facilities that are of considerable value. Second, Australia knows things about certain types of military operations that we can learn from. The Australians have had actually a considerable impact on American thinking about counterinsurgency, for example, something that the American military has never been very good at, right, for reasons that go back into the 19th century and the sort of way the American military tends to think about warfare, very different than the way Australians have thought about certain types of warfare as well. And those sorts of consultations have been, I think, quite valuable for us as well. If one imagines a worst case scenario of some kind of serious geopolitical rivalry emerging in Asia, then I think contributions by Australian forces to sea lines of communication, both in the Indian Ocean and around New Guinea and Indonesia, could be quite considerable as well, depending a little bit on what sorts of forces Australia acquires over the next 10 to 20 years as well. So I think for all of, well, and I'll add one other one as well. Australia, because of where it's located, pays more attention to events happening in Asia than the United States has, and particularly events in Southeast Asia. And one of the things that allies should be good for is actually providing you with insight and wisdom and advice. So one part of the U.S.-Australian relationship and our relationship with other parties in Asia should be occasionally for people in Washington to actually listen to what our allies are saying about events in the region and what's happening in Indonesia or what's happening in other parts of Southeast Asia, because your ear may be closer to it than ours. I think for all of those reasons, it's a robust relationship. And I should just add, this is not a particularly realist point I'm going to make here, but I also do think there have been sufficiently strong and warm relations between the two peoples, and that adds some value to it as well. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks. I'm Thomas Gregory, a recent student here at ANU. You're an American academic and we're an Australian audience, so this is probably a cheeky question, but what's the other side of this conversation in China? I presume there are discussions about what the next 50, 100 years might look like, what the lessons from history are, the way they understand it. We talk about World War I, but they must have historical analogies, and they presumably have academics and students and government people who talk about these things. What's your perception of their understanding of this story?
I am not an expert on Chinese domestic politics or Chinese strategic culture. I'm sort of more of a general IR person, although I'm paying a lot more attention to what's going on in China. So I'll give you my impression, but there are others here who I think probably focus more direct attention on China and drill down very deeply. I think the basic Chinese strategic narrative is that the past 200 years have been a very unfortunate episode in China's history. That it has a rich and glorious history at one time, thinking of itself as the world's greatest civilization, and then it fell on hard times and suffered 200 years of various humiliations, right? And then beginning with the revolution, right, it began to dig itself out. Now, I would argue, from I think a fairly detached perspective, that much of the Maoist period in China was a continued disaster, right? And that had China been under different management after sort of restoring some authority, it would have been in even better shape. But that's a separate question. I think the Chinese view is that once they began the four modernization, some 30 years ago, that they are finally back and moving towards their rightful place in the global system and ending that 200 years of resentment and humiliation and vulnerability, where they were beaten up by a number of other countries in very unpleasant ways. And that's, by the way, why I say that the Chinese see the world in power politics terms, because they understand what it's like to be weak and the consequences that has. And the contrast, again, with the United States, which has had the world's most favorable history, right? The worst war we ever fought was one we fought with each other. Our Civil War was actually the most punishing military conflict we've ever really had. We haven't been invaded since 1812, And we started that war, by the way. Dumb idea. So the contrast with America's narrative, which is a much more upbeat, world is our oyster. Now, I think that this creates a sense that they are entitled to begin to adjust current international arrangements that they regard as unfairly imposed upon them in moments of weakness. The fact that these various rocks and islands that they are now claiming, they really belong to them, and the only reason they aren't in their hands is because of this unfortunate period, undeserved. Now we get a sort of puzzle. Until relatively recently, I think the rest of the Chinese narrative was sort of a long-term view. We're going to continue to develop at home. We have lots of internal challenges. We still have hundreds of millions of people living in poverty. We have an aging population. We have an infrastructure challenge that's really quite substantial because most of China's development is on the coastline, and what's inland is still in pretty rough shape in many cases. We have environmental challenges that are really quite considerable, not enough water, not enough arable land, et cetera. So they've got a big agenda at home. And so they should be patient, right? Continue to develop, and maybe if the United States is the 800-pound gorilla in the international system, by 2050, China can be the 2,000-pound gorilla, and at that point, maybe it's time to think about revising, but don't try to do this too early. That, I think, runs at odds or in some tension with what we've seen the last couple of years, where Chinese appear to be more assertive, less sympathetic to others' views, more one-sided in declaring their claims and not being willing to listen to sort of anybody else's alternative claims. And which of these sort of competing views is going to win out, I don't know yet. Whether the rather sharp reaction by the United States and other countries in Asia over the last couple of years may cause the Chinese to sort of say, oops, we sort of overreached, we should trim our sails a bit, or it may be seen by them as just another case of outside powers trying to keep us down and keep us weak, and we cannot allow this to happen. And then I think the question of sort of which of these views wins out within the Chinese elite, and I can't forecast that one.
Can we go up the back there?
Thank you for your comments. My name is Rosemary Ganley, and I'm a member of the Royal United Services Institute and also Kokoda. Could we talk a moment about the Philippines? I've lived long enough to see the Americans there. I've seen the Americans leave, and you tell me now they're coming back. Two parts of the question. What was the main driver for the Philippines? Economics or China? And what will China's view be of you returning to the Philippines?
Right. Well, we still don't fully know what, quote, returning to the Philippines means. It will not be, I think, MacArthur-esque. I shall return. And I think it's already clear that we're not going to, at least anytime soon, recreate the kind of infrastructure that we had there at Subic Bay. What it sounds like, and just for those of you who don't remember, the United States had, first of all, the Philippines were an American colony, one of the few we did have, and the United States had a very extensive military base there through much of the Cold War until the early 1990s at Subic Bay. And we had a very close relationship with the Philippine government, which ultimately turned out to be not a very nice government. This is the Marcos regime, deeply corrupt, which the United States, as it did with a number of other countries, backed them until really it was untenable to continue to back them, at which point we were willing to sort of see him go. Partly in reaction to our long support for various Philippine politicians, including Marcos, the Filipinos voted not to extend the American presence at Subic Bay, and the United States left in the early 1990s. We withdrew our military forces. We still had the mutual security treaty, mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, but we were no longer present. After 9/11, the United States has been involved in a mostly advisory capacity as the Philippines have been going after various insurgents of their own, some of whom appear to be at least somewhat linked to some version of Al-Qaeda. So we've done a little bit of helping there, but we have not had it as a military facility. The agreement that was, I think, signed yesterday will allow American forces to use some Philippine facilities on a rotational basis. So at least from what I have seen in the news so far, it is not establishing, a new air wing that will be based in the Philippines, a submarine base, an aircraft carrier permanently home ported in Subic Bay or anything like that, but rather American forces will come in, will exercise with Philippine forces, may train there for a while and then leave, and then another group might come in a few months later. But I say that a little bit tentatively because I haven't read the terms of the agreement. I don't know what else might have been talked about. It is, in short, we're returning to be able to use some Philippine facilities. Now, why are the Filipinos doing this? I don't think money has much to do with this. I think it has everything to do with the confrontations that have been going on in the South China Sea, where the Filipinos have been, not surprisingly, given how weak they are, on the losing end of most of those exchanges. I think there's a Philippine ship that's grounded on a reef someplace, and they keep having to resupply them, and the Chinese keep interfering with the resupply. And given all of that, the Filipinos were willing to reverse course on the position that they took in the early 1990s before any of these problems emerged.
There's one in the middle up the back that was there earlier on.
Colin Lyons is my name, and I work for a government department unrelated to tonight's presentation. Your presentation highlights the very different approaches that America and China take to wielding influence and winning friends. One has been involved in wars for 100 years all over the world, and China stays at home and wields economic influence. Doesn't appear to get involved in conflicts anywhere outside its borders. Why do you think they do that, and is there a lesson there for the United States in terms of what's the most successful approach?
I'm going to partly agree with you and partly disagree. I mean, my own personal view is that the United States has been, in recent years, overly willing to use military force in places where it was not in our interest and not in the interest of the countries that we were either attacking or claiming to help. So, for example, I was a very public opponent of the decision to invade Iraq in 2003, which I thought was massively boneheaded and unnecessary, and unfortunately I turned out to be right. I wish I had been wrong about that one. So I am in sympathy with the thrust of your comment. I think some of the other wars the United States has fought in the 20th century were entirely justified. I'm glad we got into World War I. I'm glad we got into World War II, etc. Vietnam, I think, was, again, another mistake. So there's some smart wars and not so smart wars in there. It is not true that China has not been using military force. China invaded Vietnam in 1979, and China fought a brief border war with India in 1962. Which, by the way, India provoked, but China has not been shy about using military force. And you'll recall China did intervene in the Korean War rather significantly, and I think lost about 300,000 troops in the Korean War. So they've been willing to use force. They've used it right around their borders, but that's because they had no capacity to go anywhere and use it anywhere else, right? They were a relatively weak country until relatively recently. And so you would not want to base your forecasts of what China might do with its military in 2040 on what Mao was able to do with his military in 1952 or 1962 or even 1979. They just didn't have much capability. If China has the world's largest economy, has an ocean-going fleet, has other forms of power projection, you'd have to assume they might be more willing to use them. Whether they become as enthusiastic as we have been in recent decades, I don't know. I hope they don't, but I would also like the United States to be a little bit slower to use force than it's been in recent years too.
Hello, Adam Smith. I'm here in a personal capacity, but I work at the Australian Federal Police. Fascinating talk. I found it very interesting. Thank you. It just seems to me that given China's growing confidence and their bellicose attitudes, particularly, like I said, in the East China Sea, you've got flashpoints like the islands, disputed islands. You've got perhaps a defence treaty with Taiwan. China obviously has talked about that's a part of its home territory. You've got South Korea and North Korea and obviously China's involvement in any potential conflict there, and the humiliation that China had from the Second World War by the invasion by the Japanese. It seems as though it's inevitable, given what's happened recently with China, that there will be some type of conflict and America will be drawn into that via their defence treaties. What do you have to say about that?
Well, a lot of it depends on circumstances. I mean, first of all, I think that if you shouldn't make an alliance with other countries and you shouldn't have defense treaties if you're not willing to fulfill them. If you can't imagine yourself ever actually having to meet the terms of them, then you shouldn't have made the agreement in the first place. It's just a bluff, and it's actually a dangerous bluff because it may encourage, in some circumstances, the countries you have the partnership with to do things thinking you'll protect them when you might not. Just as a slight digression, I mean, this is my great concern about the enthusiasm with which we've been expanding NATO over the last 20 years, where we expanded NATO without ever really believing we were going to have to actually meet any of these commitments to Latvia or Estonia or some of these other countries. And we should have thought a little bit harder about just how far we really thought our vital interests extended. Now, Ukraine is not a NATO member, so we don't have a security commitment there. But I believe that's the problems we're facing in Ukraine are partly due to the fact that we've been so enthusiastic about moving NATO eastward. So I think all of those security partnerships, if the terms of the treaty are challenged, the United States is going to have to meet those, or the agreements don't mean much. That is also an opportunity for diplomacy. So the American position vis-a-vis Taiwan, for example, ever since the 1970s, has been highly conditional. If Taiwan is the target of an unprovoked attack by China, an attempt to change the status quo by force, the United States is committed to engage. And we've made that clear to China, we've made that clear to Taiwan. If, on the other hand, conflict breaks out because Taiwan has provoked China in certain ways, for example, by declaring various forms of independence, we've made it clear that at that point, Taiwan is on its own. Right? And the purpose here is sort of, we're deterring both our ally from doing things we don't want and China from doing things we don't want. And the American position has always been that if Taiwan and China can work this out amongst themselves, we would not stand in their way. So if at some point Taiwan wanted to be like Hong Kong, have a sort of special status within larger China in 2050, 2060, whenever, the United States would not oppose that. Similarly, I think a Chinese military challenge directed at the Senkakus would be met with an American response, and that's precisely what Obama said when he was in Japan. What comes with that, though, is also some, at least I hope, some rather candid conversations to the Japanese about not taking steps that raise the temperature there unnecessarily. So I don't think, we really want to see Japan put a Sony plant on the Senkakus or something else that would be perceived as simply a provocative gesture, and we would probably counsel the Japanese to do that. And in very extreme cases, you sometimes have to tell your allies, look, if you take that next step, we're not going to be with you because we think it's unwise and unnecessary. But in general, most of the scenarios you laid out, I think the United States would be committed for the reasons I already articulated.
Thank you. Jonathan Cheng from the Crawford School of Public Policy. Let me reverse the question that was raised by the first gentleman here and ask you, given Australia's relatively safe geographical position, what is the benefit, in your opinion, to Australia of maintaining this strong relationship with the United States? I
think the world is very uncertain, and the you can never quite know how politics is going to go in particular regions, particularly when very powerful countries are involved. And I think, therefore, when you know, as my friend John Mearsheimer likes to say, you know, when states get into trouble, there's no 911 number to call. 911 is the emergency number in the United States. You can't call Ban Ki-moon and get any help. You'll get his sympathy. He'll put you on the agenda at the Security Council, but he's got nothing else he can do for you. And therefore, countries who think that at some point they might face a significant challenge of one form or another, it's good to have friends, right? That's as true for the United States, given even though we're quite powerful and quite easily defended over there in the Western Hemisphere, but it's good for us to have friends in various parts of the world. And if I were Australia and I looked at my history and I looked at the emerging constellation of forces in Asia, I would think that having the United States as an ally would be a really nice insurance policy to have, particularly because we have one other virtue. We're way the hell and gone the other far. We're a long way away. And that's actually a virtue because although we have our interests in Asia, the ones I've already laid out, we don't really want to occupy anybody here. We don't want to try and dictate all the politics of the regions too far away, too hard to do. A really powerful country that's somewhat closer is a little bit more worrisome. I agree with the thrust of your question. You know, a rising China probably does not pose as immediate a threat to Australia as it would to Vietnam or the Philippines or Taiwan or Japan or conceivably South Korea. But a world in which China casts a very large shadow over those countries is also a world where Australia will find itself somewhat in the shade as well. And having powerful friends is useful in those circumstances.
Down the front here.
Professor Walt, David Goyne, just asking questions as a private citizen, I guess, in this case. One of the things about alliances and bluffing is when it's necessary, you need to have a military way of following through on that. I think one of the risks that we face at the moment is neither of the two potentially great powers, if it did come to a conflict, have a military way of affecting each other workably. Do you see a solution to that? I mean, A2AD keeps the US out. China can't get out beyond that to get the resources it needs.
Right. Well, I think one of the things we're going to see in the next 20 or 30 years is a very familiar, let's call it an arms race, but a military-to-military competition, which will have many dimensions to it. China has been working on trying to make it costly for the United States to move close to China, but that doesn't mean they've succeeded. It may change the way in which the United States does it. We may be a little bit more leery of sending, carrier battle groups close to China, but there are other assets that we can bring in, submarines in particular, where we're very, very good. And it's a little hard. I mean, one of the things that is of concern when balances of power are shifting, or when competitions like this are happening, there is a danger of miscalculation because both sides decide they're better than they are, or both sides are confident that they're better than the other side, and they can't both be right, right? And we have this other interesting situation where the United States military has been pretty busy for a long time, as a previous question indicated. Chinese military in certain realms hasn't got much experience at all. It's much better than it was 20 years ago, but is it as good as it thinks it is? Or are they realistic about their own capabilities vis-a-vis us, or do they get overconfident? Alternatively, are they better than we think and they surprise us at some point? The difficulty here is when the balance of capabilities isn't clear, it's easier to get some sort of miscalculation. I guess it's too early for me to sort of concede that they have made sufficient military strides that the United States is not going to be able to operate in extremis if it wants to. And by the way, I just do want to footnote, we are talking about a very unlikely scenario here. This question is really about these two major powers deciding they're willing to have a shooting war in which many people will die, at least at sea and possibly elsewhere. And that's an enormous step, which I don't think either country would enter into lightly. I think it's actually fairly unlikely. I'd worry a little bit more about minor clashes with other countries that then draw the United States in. People think it can be small and it expands accidentally, but I don't think for the foreseeable future it's in either country's interest to really test, which one is better at this point.
Maybe just that lady.
Hi, my name is Mish, and I'm a first-year student at ANU. I'd just like to know if you think there's any substance to Chinese government official claims that the US is spreading China threat theories to delegitimize its rise, to mute its place in international discourse, and to sabotage its chances of reshaping itself into an international citizen who is upstanding. Do you think that to some degree the concerns expressed by the US are a thinly veiled containment policy?
There's a lot of very loaded language in what you just said. And I want to try and answer it sort of fairly. There was a statement made, actually, following the signing of this new agreement with the Philippines, where Evan Medeiros, who's the National Security Council and probably senior director who works on these issues in East Asia, said something like, this new agreement with the Philippines is not directed against China. And I thought that was silly. We would not be doing this were it not for the rise of China. Well, that said, and so the Obama administration and the Bush administration before it and the Clinton administration before it has all gone to great lengths to try and say, we're not trying to start a Cold War with China. We're not trying to contain China. That's a bad word. I would use it, but I'm not a government official. They've really tried to avoid that kind of language, and they've tried to make it clear that they want to manage the relationship. They want a constructive relationship with China. They want to continue to develop economically. Every U.S. official I can think of tends to always say that, we're delighted by China's economic rise. We think that's wonderful for the Chinese people, and it's also helped lots of other people get richer. It's good for the United States. And I think they genuinely believe it. That's sincere. It's not a veiled, they're just saying this. But at the same time, American officials and officials in other countries, including countries that have extensive economic ties with China, where people have made a lot of money, and that would say include Japan, off of economic dealings with China, are worried by China's growing capabilities and some of the things they can do with them, some of the things they are doing with them, and some of the things they might do with them in the future. So nobody wants to sort of sit there and say, this is all about containing China and keeping them weak. And I don't think that's what people want. What they want is preventing a situation where China is able to dominate this region. If China never becomes strong enough to try that, or chooses not to try that, then it's going to be a relatively tranquil period. Not perfectly tranquil, but relatively tranquil. The reason I'm not wildly optimistic is that I think it's asking a lot of China to sort of accept a status quo in which the United States, the other major power, is still a pretty substantial presence here. And that's why I think there's going to still be friction.
Time for one more question, maybe up the back there.
Hi, my name is Natalie. I'm a student at ANU, but I'm actually from the National University of Singapore. So I noticed that you didn't really mention that much, at least in this address, about the role of the many in intersecting discussions such as ADMM+8, of which Australia, I believe, is part of as well. But what is from your point of view, the efficacy of these kind of discussions in mediating the US-China conflict?
Well, Asia probably is one of the sort of pioneering regions in developing a zillion multilateral forums. I mean, ASEAN being the sort of classic example, but I can't keep track of them anymore, and I can't remember which ones are which. Who's in APEC and who's in the Asian Regional Forum and all of that. And and so there are a lot of these institutions, and I think at a certain level they are perfectly useful. They certainly do no harm at providing forums where people can lay out their positions, can talk to one another, can facilitate diplomacy in various ways. That's fine. They don't involve significant multilateral commitments to one another to come to one another's aid or things like that, so they're not really alliances. They're not, I think, ultimately a solution to the security problems, and ASEAN's inability, for example, to make much headway on the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, despite several efforts to do that. And the fact that the most recent ASEAN forum wasn't it the one that Cambodia, they couldn't issue a final communique because the Cambodians China was leaning on Cambodia to not go along with it as well. I think that suggests that these are forums that are useful but of only limited utility in dealing with most of these things. And that's also, just good realist that I am. The other thing to remember is that international institutions of all kinds are useful tools that states employ to advance their interests. They cannot control what major powers do. The United Nations, ASEAN, APEC, the Asian Regional Forum, right, et cetera, are not going to be able to turn to Beijing and say, stop that, or turn to Washington and say, stop that, right, and get either country to do something that it thinks is not in its interest. And that's sort of the nature of international politics, even in the 21st century. On that gloomy note,
ladies and gentlemen, I just want to, on your behalf and certainly on behalf of the National Security College, thank Professor Walt for that informed and engaging perspective on the issues of China's rise and the role of the region and the wider world in response to it. I've always felt the best presentations of these kinds are those that actually present arguments and counter-arguments that reach conclusions but are not dogmatic or ideological. And I think tonight we had a presentation of that order where there was no assumed wisdom, but simply a search for understanding of what are very complex realities and very changeable realities. And I think bringing Professor Walt's background in the conceptual framework of international relations to bear on this critically important issue today has been something that's been hugely valuable for all of us attending and for all of those that may see this through a wider medium. So I'd very much like to thank him for that insight and perspective, and for the style and substance that he brought to addressing this very complex issue this evening. This may not rank along many of the other accolades you've received, Stephen, over the years, but we at the National Security College have decided to mark the contribution of distinguished speakers at occasions like this with a small memento, and we hope that when you at least occasionally look at this little memento, you'll think fondly of the ANU in Australia, and that you'll come back here again. This is your first visit to Australia. We would very much like to welcome you back at some stage. It's been a great honour for us to have you here for a brief period. I should add that when we first publicised this seminar, we had to close it off in record time because we could have filled this many, many times over. And I think that gives you a sense of the interest in Australia in the issues that you're focused on, and the great desire that all of us would have to see you back here in Canberra. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your contribution this evening.
now that I know the way, it will
Yeah, it's the way back that's the problem. Can I also just finally, before we all go, thank you very much for your attendance this evening. It's wonderful to have this level of support for these special occasions, and we look forward to many of them in the future. They'll all be advertised on the website. I think we're getting quite slick now in the way that we can process people's applications. So thank you very much for your support, and we hope to keep this series rolling in the near future, so watch that website. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you soon.